Alright, YouTube, we're back. We're talking FF7. We're talking some Rebirth, and we have kind of a lot to talk about. I don't know how much we're going to get into today with this particular video, but I just know there's been a lot of interviews and things over the last couple of days. Specifically on Shinra Arch's feed on Twitter, I've just seen them put out a lot of stuff. Just covering the Reddit AMA that Katase and Hamaguchi did yesterday. Also, I've seen them quote things from Shack News and Game Rant and probably other shit. So there's just kind of a lot out there. I just don't know what all we're going to talk about. As per usual, I'm just going to kind of go down their feed on Twitter and just see what's worth talking about. Let's hop into it. So this is obviously from the Red AMA. It says, asked if Cloud commands the Black Whisperers when they open up a portal to Aerith, or if Sephiroth granted him entrance. FF7 Rebirth director Naoki Yamaguchi says that's a spoiler, so they can't answer that, unfortunately. It's honestly a pretty interesting question that I never considered, having just recently played through Rebirth and seeing this scene not that long ago. Got the platinum, by the way. I'd never felt like anything was off there, but having this question now, and then watching back the scene where they Cloud goes to the Whisper Wall, when he calls out to Aerith, a couple Whispers fly at the wall and kind of create the hole, and I never thought anything weird about that for some reason. Kind of an interesting scene now in hindsight, because is it Cloud controlling them? As soon as he called out to Aerith, they flew at the wall, right? Or is it Sephiroth helping him? I'd lean more towards the latter, just because Sephiroth is obviously manipulating Cloud and wants him to do certain things. Obviously wants him to be there for Aerith's death to break him. Also, Cloud controlling them in some way is a little bit interesting, because you could go some different ways with it. Maybe it's to further show the manipulation from Sephiroth, that he's so manipulated by Sephiroth, even if he doesn't know it, that he has some level of control over the Whisperers, or maybe Sephiroth has given him control of the Whisperers temporarily. I'm not really sure which one I like more, but I do lean more towards it being Sephiroth that just opened the portal, essentially. Asked about future interactions between Zack and Elmyra, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth director Naoki Yamaguchi says that Zack plays an important role in the remake project, and he's glad people enjoyed his interactions with Elmyra. So this actual question that was answered is fine for what it is, because it's just asking if there's going to be more between Zack and Elmyra in the next game, in terms of scenes and stuff like that, right? And the answer they gave is fine. It's very generic. But this sort of stems from people were asking actually about the relationship between Zack and Elmyra. And when I say relationship, I mean romantic relationship. This ridiculous ass question here that wasn't answered, because why would it be, that says, is there any significance to the potentially romantic Zack Fair and Elmyra Gainsborough relationship begun in Rebirth? I had to hazard a guess here. This generally stems from people that are Claris, because they want to ship Cloud with anybody that's not Tifa, and Zack with anybody that's not Aerith. That way they can be in love together, right? And they've literally shipped Tifa and Zack together, even though they don't fucking barely know each other. They met each other one day, right? So I assume that's where this comes from. Zack talked to Elmyra in Rebirth, so they must be romantically fucking involved. It's just idiotic. There's not a single drop, a single fucking ounce of romantic goddamn anything between Elmyra and Zack. At all, in any capacity. Shut the fuck up. FF7 Rebirth director Naoki Yamaguchi says his favorite character in the FF7 franchise is Cloud. Producer Yoshinori Kitase's favorite is Vincent. He didn't have a big role in Rebirth, but he's looking forward to him in the next installment. In the last bit of that answer there, I feel like Vincent got quite a bit for a game where he's not going to be a playable character, right? He gets a lot of time in the Nibelheim chapter when we go back there, whatever chapter it is, I don't remember off the top of my head. And also when he travels with us around the world, we get some scenes with him here and there. He helps with the Temple of the Ancients. It's crucial for us escaping Temple of the Ancients and shit, right? And he's there with when we go to the Forgotten Capital and stuff. There's a freaking boss fight with him. He's a part of the Queen's Blood storyline, right? He's the penultimate person you play. There's a side quest in the Shinra Manor with him. There's a lot of stuff for Vincent, I feel for, again, a game where he's not going to be a playable party member. We'll obviously get more of Vincent in the next game, which is super exciting. And in a lot of ways, looking forward to Vincent's combat. Since I got so immersed in the combat of Rebirth recently, I'm very, very curious how they're going to handle him. And I hope it's well. I'm sure it will be. I think every character, for what they could do with each character, is pretty great, because you gotta make each character unique when it comes to combat. I feel like every character is pretty fucking unique right now. I do wonder what they're gonna do with Sid. He's obviously a Dragoon, too. Obviously the jumping mechanic that Dragoons have in the Final Fantasy games. But I wonder what they're gonna do overall with the character of Sid. What's his gimmick, right? I'm sure a lot of you out there know that Zack is my favorite character. I can't shut the fuck up about it. But I don't think I've ever asked you guys who your favorite character is when it comes to FF7. So following the question that was asked on Reddit, who's your favorite FF7 character? FF7 Rebirth director Naoki Yamaguchi says the overall direction of the story of the trilogy was decided upon from the beginning of development, and they worked out some details as development progressed. The answer itself is not really anything new. We've heard this a lot coming from them. I assume the question was something along the lines of did fan feedback and influence the game or something like that? And to a certain degree, that is going to be the case, even if they say it's not. I don't think that they necessarily altered the overall story, but we've talked about a lot on the channel that I feel like to a certain degree they pull back on some elements of Remake, right? I don't know how much. We can never really know that, obviously. But there seemed to be like a grander design with Remake in a lot of ways, with the defined fate and destiny and changes in the future, that whole thing, whatever. There's not really a ton of stuff like that in Rebirth, like there was in Remake, where we're like breaking away from Destiny or attempting to break away from Destiny, and like the Whispers like intervene and change things back to where they're supposed to be. And even though we'd like defied fate at the end of Remake, we pretty much still just do the FF7 story. There's not like a ton of difference, right? There's obviously new elements when it comes to the FF7 story because it's a remake, with like how they handle the Black Materia with the Gi tribe, things like that. There is new shit, but there's none of the new Destiny stuff, where other than like Zack and the Planet, I guess. And to a certain degree, that can maybe be the point. It's something you see in like stories that deal with Destiny, where like no matter what you do, it always plays out the same, more or less, right? Like even if you defy Destiny, it'll get back on track at some point, and you'll still kind of go to the same end goal, right? That could be part of what they're trying to do with the story, I guess. But just coming off of the end of Remake into Rebirth, it just feels like something was kind of missing, and maybe there'll be more explained or shown in the third game potentially. Who knows? As for favorite songs in FF7 Rebirth, director Naoki Yamaguchi said, "No promises to keep." Producer Yoshinori Kitase said, "Bow wow wow." For, I guess, my favorite track when it comes to FF7 Rebirth, I mean, for one, it's a Final Fantasy game. It's a FF7 game. It's Nobuo Uematsu. It's all fucking good. There's not a bad track I can think of. But I think to this day still, it's probably whatever the track is called that plays in Gongaga, dude. Something about that is just so relaxing to me. There's such a vibe to that track. But my overall favorite Final Fantasy song, as I've talked about on the channel a few times, is Listen to the Cries of the Planet. Or I've seen it called other shit sometimes, but the track that plays in the original game in the Forgotten Capital, that's probably my overall favorite track. Any sort of modern interpretation of that, whether that's in Remake or Rebirth, is a very top tier song to me too. FF7 Rebirth director Naoki Yamaguchi says his favorite character to use in combat is Yuffie. Kitase's favorite is Barret. Kitase is a man after my own heart, because Barret has been my favorite since Remake. I like the way they improved him a bit with Rebirth, where he got a couple new abilities, like the last round, which I really love, where he does more damage and builds stagger better for so many shots, right? I really love that ability. But I will say I did like Yuffie a lot. I didn't really like. I don't want to say that I didn't like her combat in Intermission. Maybe I just didn't understand it entirely. But her combat in Rebirth, I absolutely fucking loved. She's like her ninjutsu stuff that was already in Intermission, where you have like an enemy's weakness, right? Whether they're weak to air, ice, fire, lightning, whatever. She has that because you can always change the element of it, which is nice. So you don't have to necessarily put any kind of magical materia on her, but also just really like doppelganger. That shit's fun. And obviously the ATB ward Brumal form spam makes like some of the harder fights in the game very, very fucking trivial. Gotta throw Cloud in there though, because he's an absolute beast in the game, and he's a part of some of the hardest fights in the game, right? And Prime mode gets you through a lot of shit in that game. So like definitely I gotta even though Cloud's not like super unique in his combat necessarily, definitely one of the better characters in the game. I will say, if we get more fights in the next game with like say Zack and or Sephiroth, I would like them to like flesh out Zack's kit a little better, just because he doesn't have a lot. Like his like spells that he has is pretty damn good, obviously, but he only has like 2 abilities, right? And he has like the charge thing, which is kind of cool, I guess, but you don't really ever use it. I mean, you could use it, I guess, on like a normal mode playthrough. But like in the simulator fights where you're going against like the fucking hardest fights in the game, like you're never gonna sit there and like use charge with fucking Zack, right? He's just like support for Cloud essentially. And he has like quite a few abilities to pick from if you look at like the DMW from Crisis Core. So I don't know why they only gave him like Chain Strike or Chain Slash, whatever it's called, and like Meteor Shots, right? Like there's other abilities you could be doing with Zack too. And it feels like Sephiroth has a lot more for like his abilities and stuff, like what he can do in combat. So it'd be kind of nice just to make it a little bit more even. Plus, I love me some Zack, obviously, so I'd like to see him get some more love. Fuck. So this one's kind of interesting. FF7 Rebirth director Naoki Yamaguchi says it isn't exactly that the Zack intermission scene was scrapped per se, but within the inner workings of the background of the game, they have the essence of the multiple worlds. The intention was to provoke discussion. If you haven't seen the video of Baby still asking that question, he brings up obviously the episode intermission ending. The scene, at least the question he asks, is that it's implied that Aerith and Zack haven't met yet, whereas in Rebirth, obviously, Zack's by Aerith's side like the whole fucking game. If there's going to be any sort of like follow-up to that, are we going to need to keep this scene in mind going into like the next game? I like the TLDR on the question, right? To give my thoughts, I mean, obviously we talked about the episode intermission ending a lot, because I won't ever shut the fuck up about the cross when we'll ever stop talking about it. I don't necessarily think it's implied that with that scene he's never met Aerith, because he's prepping to have a conversation with Aerith. It's something we talked about on the channel months ago at this point. He hasn't talked to Aerith in years, even though he's bedside with Aerith in Rebirth the whole game, right? And he's talking to her. He hasn't had a face-to-face conversation in forever, right? So the way that I've always kind of interpreted this scene, like long before we ever even got to Rebirth, was that he's just nervous to talk to her. It's been a long time, right? The last thing he got from her was a letter saying that it was the last letter, that she hadn't heard from him in like 5 years or whatever, right? So like, That's what I always got from this scene, is that he's just like, what am I going to say to her? I haven't talked to her in a long time. And if this takes place, let's say sometime after Rebirth, he still hasn't talked to her, right? Even though he's talked to her when she's bedridden, he hasn't actually talked to her. They haven't had a conversation, so he's just prepping what he's going to say to her. And we're told in Rebirth by Marlene that whenever Aerith dies, she's going to wake up in that world, right? So the way I've kind of interpreted this scene post-Rebirth is that maybe Aerith woke up, but she's not at Elmyra's house. Maybe Zack's off doing something, comes back to the house, Aerith's not there. He assumes she's at the church, so he gets to the church, he's prepping what he's going to say, and then he walks in there, and then there's no Aerith. Why are the people in there? I don't fucking know, dude. We've talked about that forever, too. Who knows? Now, does that mean that I'm right? Not necessarily. You can interpret this scene 1,000 different ways, as we all have for the last couple of years, right? It could be implied that maybe in this world that they're in, this timeline, whatever we're going to call it, like he hasn't met Aerith, talked to Aerith, or anything like that. Sure, that could be the case. The other kind of theories out there post-Rebirth is that it's just one of the many worlds, one of the different like outcomes or something. Like this is just one of the other worlds with the stamp logo that, you know, things are just different. And maybe that's a world where Zack hasn't met Aerith, come across Aerith yet. It could also just be a different world where things are different and we never get a payoff for it. Again, like Hamaguchi said, it was just meant to like kind of spark discussion. So there might not be any kind of payoff to the scene at all. Which would be quite underwhelming, and it might be the case too, because like they said, it's just to spark discussion. So there may be no payoff. Like it might just, this was like put at the end of Episode Intermission just to, you know, subtly imply before we ever even knew it that there's multiple worlds, right? And that was all it was meant for. And there may never be a follow-up to the scene, which would suck. And it's one of like the few things that I sort of kind of dislike in some ways when it comes to the remake project. Like that's the reason we got the Aerith death scene at the end of Rebirth the way we got it, because they want you to talk about it. Is she alive? Is she dead? What happened? What's going on, right? Like that's the whole point of the ending. They didn't just give you Aerith's death. They want you to talk about it for the next 3 years until the fucking next game comes out, right? Obviously, the scene is also from Cloud's perspective, and it's him not accepting her death. That's kind of the whole point of it as well. But ultimately, it's just so we talk about it for the next 3 years. All in all, though, I think it's like a kind of good question, kind of good answer. It doesn't really give us anything other than potentially confirming that the scene doesn't matter at all, because it might just be there just so we talk about it. That's maybe the only point of the fucking scene at the church, right? Personally, I think a much better question if we're going to talk about the ending of Episode Intermission would be about the cross, right? Does it fucking matter? That'd be like the one question I'd ask them around that scene. There's a wooden cross in the church in the Zack Episode Intermission scene. I don't see it anywhere else so far in the trilogy, and they've intentionally removed it from like everything they put out, like Crisis Core Reunion, First Soldier, Ever Crisis, things like that. But in the rest of the compilation, the original FF7, the original Crisis Core, Advent Children, things like that, the wooden cross is there. So I've always felt like there's a purpose to it. So I think that'd be like an interesting question to ask them, because their answer would be particularly interesting. Would they just confirm that it's like a dev error? Was it a mistake, or is there significance? I just personally feel like that's a bit more of an interesting question if we're going to talk about that scene at all. But I think it's where we're going to wrap the video up. We had kind of a long discussion with that last question, right? And we went through all the Reddit AMA stuff that Shinra Arch posted. That doesn't mean there's not more to talk about, because it's just what they decided to tweet out, right? I could go to the Reddit AMA itself, the thread, and kind of go through the questions, and we could talk about it maybe tomorrow or something. And as I mentioned towards the beginning of the video, there is like other stuff out there from like other interviews from Game Rant and Shack News and whatever. So we might talk about that shit tomorrow too. But of course, pass off to you guys. We talked about a lot of different things in this video. What are your thoughts overall? I guess specifically with the big question there at the end. What do you think is going on with the Zack scene? Is there significance to it? Is it a different world? Do you think the Zack that we're seeing in that scene has never met Aerith at all in this particular timeline or world? Do you think it's just him prepping to have a conversation with Aerith? What do you think is going on? Also, what are your thoughts on the cross? Let's talk about the cross again. It's super exciting. I love talking about the cross. Hell yeah. Anyways, that's the video. Subscribe to the channel if you guys are new. Social networks in the description below. Follow me on Twitter, _YT. That's it. Bye.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Logain, or leave it like Cobain.